Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. So let's dive right into this masterclass. When you bite into an incredibly crispy sourdough bread or tear open a soft, flaky croissant, it's super easy to just praise the quality of the flour. But have you ever actually stopped to think about where that baking chemistry truly begins? It doesn't start in the mixing bowl. No, it starts at the microscopic molecular layers of a single seed, what the industry calls the wheat kernel or the wheat berry. People so often think that grinding wheat into flour is just, a simple mechanical process. But where does baking chemistry truly begin? To find out, we really have to look a lot deeper. It's not just crushing seeds. We have to understand the precise botanical structures of the wheat kernel itself. Because honestly, if you don't understand the molecular breakdown of this little seed, you're never going to be able to fully control things like fermentation, gluten development, and enzyme activity in your dough. So today, we're taking the wheat berry and putting it right under the microscope. To decode these invisible layers and understand baking as a true science, here is our roadmap for today. Number 1, the outer shield. 2, the 7-layer bran. 3, the volatile germ. And 4, the endosperm vault. Let's get into it. Starting off with number 1, the outer shield, scientifically known as Triticum aestivum. We're beginning our journey from the outside in, looking at the completely non-edible protective shield that surrounds commercial baking wheat. The sheer defensive power of what we call the husk, or the chaff, is just absolutely fascinating. Now, the husk has literally zero use in baking, but nature engineered it brilliantly. It's made of pure cellulose and silica. And this composition is exactly what keeps the seed alive while it's sitting out there in the fields. It completely blocks mechanical pests, reflects harsh ultraviolet rays, prevents water damage, and literally stops fungal diseases dead in their tracks. But here's the catch. During the harvesting and threshing process, this husk absolutely must be completely removed. If even a microscopic fraction of this husk makes it into the milling process, your flour is going to turn incredibly bitter and take on this unappealing black color.
Right, so once that inedible husk is completely stripped away, we are left with the edible grain composition, and this basically sets up the rest of the explainer for us. The edible berry is made up of exactly 3 main parts. We've got the bran at 14%, the germ at a super tiny 3%, and the massive endosperm taking up about 83 to 85% of the kernel.
Moving on to number 2, the 7-layer bran, the outer edible wall. Let's really examine this outermost edible layer, which, as we just saw, makes up exactly 14% of the kernel's total weight. So there's a really common misconception out there that the bran is just one single solid shell. But microscopically, the bran is actually 7 distinct layers. The very outermost is the pericarp. Moving inward, we hit the testa, and this one is absolutely crucial because it's the layer that actually provides that distinct brown color to whole wheat flour. And finally, the innermost layer is the aleurone layer, which is just packed with high-density enzymes and proteins. Nutritionally speaking, these 7 layers combined are an absolute powerhouse. They're loaded with insoluble dietary fiber, B vitamins, iron, and magnesium.
But let's look at this from a pastry chef's perspective for a second. When you're making bread, the bran plays a massive, massive game with your dough's structure. It's kind of a double-edged sword. On the plus side, artisan chefs absolutely love that bran gives this highly premium, sweet, and nutty flavor with a really wonderful full-bodied texture. But there are major cons. Microscopically, bran particles are basically like sharp little crystals. So when you knead your dough, these sharp crystals physically slice right through your sensitive developing gluten strands. And honestly, this is the exact reason why a 100% whole wheat bread always has a dense crumb and simply doesn't rise as high as a bread made from white all-purpose flour.
Which brings us to number 3, the volatile germ, the reproductive core. We are now zooming right into the germination tissue of the wheat kernel.
The germ makes up a tiny, tiny 3% of the kernel's total weight. But despite being so small, this is literally the heart of the seed. This is exactly where a brand new wheat plant is born. And because it has to sustain new life, nature packed this tiny 3% with an absolute treasure trove of high-quality nutrition. We're talking B-complex vitamins, vitamin E, powerful antioxidants, and raffinose sugar. So the really crucial point here is that alongside all those vitamins, this tiny little germ contains a massive 25% pure protein. That's huge. But it also contains something that is widely considered the ultimate enemy of the commercial milling industry, lipids, which are basically natural oils and healthy fats. And here is exactly where deep food science comes into play. Because lipids are organic, oily compounds that do not dissolve in water, they create a huge dilemma for millers. If a milling machine grinds up the wheat and leaves those germ lipids inside the flour, well, those fats are suddenly exposed to the air, and this triggers rapid oxidation, leading straight to rancidity. This oxidation causes a terrible sour smell, moisture that makes the flour clump up into weird lumps, and ultimately, it completely destroys the shelf life. This specific chemical reaction is the exact reason why commercial roller mills are literally forced to completely strip out and remove the germ when they're producing standard white flour.
And finally, number 4, the endosperm vault, the energy storage house. We are heading into every baker's absolute first love, the vast endosperm, which holds the vast majority, up to 85% of the kernel's weight. Let's see how this actually translates to our everyday baking. Inside the endosperm, if you look under a microscope, you're going to see two main things. First, a massive cellular network known as the protein matrix, which is specifically made up of gliadin and gluten proteins. And second, suspended right inside that matrix are millions of tiny white starch granules. In fact, the endosperm is made of 60 to 75% pure starch. So when you go to the grocery store and buy a standard bag of commercial all-purpose flour, or Maida, you are buying exactly this, a finely grinded microscopic matrix of the pure endosperm. That's it. But the real magic? That happens when we apply heat. Gelatinization is an oven-triggered chemical process where that pure starch we just talked about actually combines with hot water. This reaction is the exact thing that sets your cakes so they don't collapse in the middle, thickens up your sauces, and solidifies the crumb structure of your bread. When you combine that with those gliadin and gluten proteins, which, by the way, hydrate to form gluten, this gelatinization process is essentially the invisible engine that literally powers the entire global baking industry. So, to summarize our deep dive today, a single wheat kernel holds some truly immense chemical engineering. You've got the 7 layers of bran, those tricky germ lipids, and an expansive, starchy endosperm matrix. Elevating your baking from just good to absolute perfection, it means thoroughly understanding and controlling this incredible microbiology that's sitting right there inside every single bag of flour in your pantry. But our journey doesn't end here at the kernel. Once this tiny grain goes into the factory, how do flour millers actually temper grains with water to alter their chemical shelf life? Why is there such a massive difference between the shelf life of all-purpose and whole wheat flour? And, leaving you with a very practical question to think about before next time, how can you identify expired, rancid flour in the market just by smelling it? We're going to answer all of this and explore the incredibly fascinating industrial side of flour in part 2 of this Masterclass Explainer. Until then, keep questioning the science behind your baking.
Okay, picture this. Imagine you've got a tiny, incredibly complex, heavily armored vault. Your one job is to extract the soft, valuable treasure locked inside without smashing that outer shell into a million little pieces. Well, that's the exact high-stakes mechanical problem we're facing every single day in the creation of flour. How on earth do we extract the pure, white endosperm of a wheat kernel without completely shattering the tough bran and ruining the flour?
Look, if you think modern milling is just taking a bunch of wheat seeds, tossing them between 2 giant rocks and mashing them into dust, well, actually, scratch that, a lot of people think that, but it's not. Behind commercial milling lies an absolute marvel called thermodynamic milling science. This is the incredibly precise application of heat, moisture, and structural engineering to cleanly separate the layers of wheat. We're literally bypassing destructive friction entirely to engineer the perfect powder.
So welcome to this explainer. I am super excited to dive into this with you today, because we're going to unpack the incredible industrial engineering and chemical science behind the everyday flour sitting in your kitchen right now. Today, we're completely decoding how massive factory operations and microscopic chemical realities dictate the baking science we all rely on. Here's our game plan for today. We'll start with the core dilemma and how tempering works. Then, we'll dive into extraction mechanics, decode those flour variants you see at the store, look at flour degradation and testing, and finally, map out the ultimate wheat matrix. Let's get right into it.
All right, part 1, tempering, and our core dilemma.
So look at this number, 15%. That right there is the absolute golden rule of industrial milling. We absolutely must hit exactly 15% target moisture. Why? Because you can never ever mill dry wheat directly. If you try to just force dry wheat through the system, the sheer mechanical friction and heat will cause that brittle outer bran layer to just shatter into microscopic fragments. Let's compare the two. If we mill dry wheat, it shatters into these low-quality fragments that turn the flour a dull, muddy brown. Nobody wants that. To fix this, the wheat undergoes a process called conditioning or tempering, where a perfectly calculated mist of water brings it to that 15% moisture mark over a few hours. What's happening biologically? Well, the outer pericarp and the germ absorb the water and get rubbery and flexible, while the starchy endosperm inside actually softens. So when it finally hits the rollers, that tempered bran doesn't shatter at all. It literally peels away flawlessly in a single sheet. It's just pure engineering.
Moving right along to part 2, extraction mechanics, dry versus wet milling.
So, how does this actually play out on the factory floor? The industry standard is dry roller milling. It all starts with these massive cylindrical steel rollers rotating at different speeds and in opposite directions. These are your break rolls and reduction rolls. Because our wheat is perfectly tempered to that magic 15% moisture, the shear force from these high-speed rollers just pops the grain right open. The rubbery bran flakes off and the endosperm is ground down into a beautifully fine white powder. From there, it drops straight into massive mechanical sifters for extremely precise separation.
But hey, it's not all dry milling. We've got to contrast that with specialized extraction methods like purling. Purling is a wet process that uses friction and abrasion to gradually polish off the outermost layers. You'll see this all the time in durum wheat and rice milling. And for the professionals watching, knowing exactly which process your miller uses is absolutely critical, because the extraction method directly impacts the starch damage and the water absorption capacity of the flour you end up with.
Okay, part 3. Let's decode those flour variants you're always seeing at the grocery store.
First up, white flour, or maida. This might actually surprise you, but it's literally pure endosperm. During the milling process we just talked about, 100% of the bran and germ are completely removed. What you're left with is a purely white, highly starchy powder that has been industrially engineered specifically to give you perfect high rise and structural stability when you bake.
Next up is brown flour. Now, a lot of folks confuse this with whole wheat, but industrially, it's a totally different beast. In the commercial industry, brown flour is actually a carefully crafted blend. It's primarily endosperm mixed back together with the germ and just a tiny, very small portion of bran. This highly specific combo is designed to give you that soft brown tone and a mild, nutty flavor, but without the heavy, dense texture of a fully unrefined grain. And that brings us to the whole shebang, true whole wheat flour, also known as atta. This is the unrefined, natural form where the entire grain is ground up together. It's got 100% of the bran, 100% of the germ, and the endosperm. Now, while this is incredibly nutritious, keeping all those anatomical layers naturally sacrifices mechanical gluten strength, so you end up with a weaker gluten chain compared to that heavily refined white flour we saw earlier.
All right, let's pivot to part 4, degradation and chemical breakdown.
So why does flour go bad? It all comes down to the wheat germ, which is packed with lipids, basically fats and natural oils. When you have a flour that still has the germ in it, like whole wheat, airborne oxygen attacks those lipids. They oxidize super fast. And that chemical breakdown, that's exactly what creates that sour, musty smell, scientifically known as rancidity. To save your next batch of baking, here are 3 quick, foolproof sensory tests you can do right now to spot oxidized, expired, or mold-prone flour. First, the smell test. Your flour should smell clean and neutral. If it smells sour or musty, it's oxidized, rancid. Toss it out. Second, the color test. You want to avoid any dull or grayish tints. And third, the texture test. Just run your hands through it and feel for tight lumps. If you feel hard lumps, moisture has breached the flour, making it a prime breeding ground for fungus and mold. No thanks.
Finally, part 5, the wheat matrix and its chemical ratios.
Let's look at the raw math here to really ground our understanding. The standard wheat kernel is a finely tuned biological package. We're talking exactly 71% carbohydrates, 13% water, a tiny 1.5% fat, and 13% protein. It's incredibly precise.
And here's the real kicker. If we zoom in on that 13% protein slice of the pie, between 75 to 80% of that total protein is pure gluten. That right there is the absolute key to structural baking science. That specific fraction of gluten provides the essential mechanical strength and elasticity you need to build those beautiful, airy breads and pastries we all love.
So how does all this science actually affect you? Well, it literally dictates your kitchen habits. Because maida, your all-purpose white flour, has had the fats and moisture industrially removed, it's a rock star on the shelf, stable for 6 to 8 months right at room temperature.
But your whole wheat flour, because we now know it contains that high lipid content from the germ, it demands strict storage in airtight containers to fight off that rapid oxidation we talked about.
So next time you grab that bag of flour to whip up some dough, ask yourself, do you actually know what's happening to the lipids in your pantry right now? Because you're no longer just baking. You're managing a delicate chemical environment shaped by intense thermodynamic engineering. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep exploring, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.